not all the time can they be successful. So after we decided we wanted to talk about different cancer therapies, we began talking about the different game mechanics. And this is where we came up with the different treatment guns, focusing on chemotherapy, targeted therapy, and immunotherapy. Our plans for Malignancy VR is to expand it into a multi-level game. And we're going to be doing this in conjunction with members of the community. So if this sounds of something of interest to you, head over to malignancyvr.com and sign up to be in touch. Furthermore, we want to take that game and then test it in a randomized clinical trial to robustly assess if virtual reality is an effective way to teach people about cancer, and more importantly, can it change or influence people's behavior and reduce their risk of cancer over a lifetime.
Hello, PAX Online. Dallas Kemp, creative director of Atomic Mass Games, back at you again with some painting and some fun for PAX. I hope you're all having a good time. I know we are. So, of course, painting miniatures, you got to paint the face, right? It's an old adage, you got to paint the face, you got to paint the base. So, I want to talk about painting faces. And we're going to do a very cool, very quick face paint with not quite washes, but we're gonna have fun, and we're gonna let's just get to it. So let's try it out. So as you can see, I got a black widow here. Now I left the arms off so that because her arms on the miniature come straight out and gets in the way of the camera. And the next step I want to do, and this is what I normally do, is I take some of my base color, that base skin tone, and I mix a little red into it. I usually find like a nice brickish red, and I thin this down with a little bit of water, but this just adds that nice warmth that we like to see in faces. Now any skin tone you do, you want to follow a lot of the same rules I'm going to be talking about here. So even if I were to go darker, I would still add a red undertone. If I was going to go lighter, like a very light pale skin, I would still add a bit of a red undertone. There's no one recipe to painting skin. Now I'm going to mix some water, and I just got a little palette over here. And this time I'm going to use a forest green, like a nice olive. I'm going to mix that once again into the base color that I chose. Now while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to take the green and the red without the base tone, mix them together, I'm gonna make like a really nice brown. So, just a nice red brown. If you don't feel it's dark enough, you can add a little red, you can add a little green. Nice. So all that did was define those deep recesses. But now I want to define the top. So I'm going to take a little bit of my off-white. I like good off-whites. I don't like pure whites typically, unless I'm highlighting white. So I'm going to take off-white, mix it into my base tone, and I'm just going to pick out some highlights. Right there where the hair part meets, tip of the nose, just under the lip where the chin is, just to give it a little highlight. And this just defines the face much better and sharpens all those features. And once again, I'm just using the tip of the brush. Let me see if I can focus in just a little bit. There we go. So very quickly, I was able to achieve a great face to get on the tabletop and just to get playing. So hopefully that was helpful and informative and something that you can practice and try at home and get your miniature painted up and get it on the tabletop. So thanks for joining me, and we'll catch you later. Keep having fun at PAX, and we'll catch you later. Bye, heroes.
And we're recording. So whenever you want to start, Betty.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming on in here to see the Psychology of Final Fantasy panel. We are so excited to be able to give this information to everybody, and never mind, go and talk with everyone about this type of fun information. And you have some great panelists here to really talk about and talk with. So without further ado, I really kind of want to introduce you to all of them, and I'm going to let them do that themselves because that's half the fun. Whoever wants to go, make it happen.
Popcorn style? All right.
Popcorn style.
I'll get it started. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Chelsea Hughes. I go by Lee or Leah. Currently, I work in strategic advisory at Riot Games. So I work in industry. Before that, I worked in mental health in college counseling centers. However, the reason I'm here today is that I'm super passionate about video games, love Final Fantasy, and I'm going to be talking with you all about trauma in the series. Particularly Final Fantasy X, one, because it's one of my favorites, and two, because it is like a trauma melting pot. It's like, there's so much going on there, and I want to be excited about that, but it's also not exactly something to be excited about. So that's me. Hello, everyone, and we'll popcorn this over to Dr. Cowart.
Hi, I am Dr. Rachel Cowart. I am a research psychologist. I'm also the research director of Take This, which is the first mental health nonprofit to form working specifically within the gaming community and the gaming industry. I'm also a science content creator, Zeitgeist, where every week I talk about things like this, like the science of games. I'm here because I kept telling Tony someone has to come talk about Final Fantasy VI. So you're going to have to just let me be here. And I'm here to talk about the storytelling of Final Fantasy. So I'll pass it to Dr. Kelly.
Bam. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me. So, hashtag HH. Honored, humbled. Hashtag HH. Oh, wait. Do that again, wait, Tony? Do it. And then it's just going to be a slow to turn it on and off. My name is Dr. Ryan Kelly. I'm a psychologist and co-founder of Geeks Like Us. It's a community-based media company that focuses on celebrating and showcasing unapologetic enthusiasm and helping people turn their passion into careers. I wanted to write for Final Fantasy largely to talk about how memories and our identity are used in this series, as well as memory loss. And I do overlap a lot with Dr. Hughes, with Leah, because trauma does tend to be the reason that happens. But I'm so glad to be here. We're very excited about doing all this. Yeah. And now I guess to, if I'm going to to Stephen. Catch it! Yeah!
What's up, everybody? I am Dr. Emery Stephen Daniel. I am an assistant professor at Appalachian State University. I'm also the marketing director at Geeks Like Us, so please give us a visit. I am on this panel mainly because I get to keep the uplifting stories of Final Fantasy. Since Dr. Anthony Bean always gives me those topics. So I will be talking about cognitive dissonance, parasocial relationships, and genocidal cults within Final Fantasy X. Again, uplifting.
Yeah, happy topics.
Happy times.
You gotta do the ha 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 with that. Come on, Mr. Doc.
Gonna be nothing but Titus giggles the entire.
Pretty much, yeah.
That's it. 20 minutes of this minutes of this panel is just going to be that.
That is accurate.
Correct.
We also have Melissa Huntley, who's coming in from Japan through a recorded video already. So we have that prepared as well. But before we kind of get started on all that fun stuff, we kind of wanted to go over the idea that we all love Final Fantasy so much that we had to just talk about all the cool psychology portions of this type of game and across the entire series and genre, that it really gives us an empowerment figure of who we are and how we play. So to give an idea, like, we have tons of different topics that we have talked about within the book that you can see in our fun little clip there to my yeah, I went right. Yep. I went the correct way. And like, say, existentialism with VV, spiritual environmentalism through Gaia and Heidegger, characterization of trauma, which we know we're going to get into really cool stuff with Leah in that, Heidegger and technology, which we're not going to talk about because that's going to go over all of our heads, a group bonding and the formation of groups and why it's important through Gestaltism, which is a really, really cool chapter. Story structure, feminine warrior. I mean, the topics are really endless. And kind of with all of that, we really, really had a fun time basically just going through all of the different games and saying, this one fits into this one explains this area, this psychology aspect is also part of this. We're like, holy crap, our minds are blown. So now we're going to blow everyone else's minds with this book as well, as we do, especially, Dr. R. Kelly blows us all minds.
I do.
Our minds.
I was going to let that go. I want it to be known that I wanted to say something, and I didn't, because I'm an adult now. I'm a man.
Now, as of last week.
Literally just now, and it's gone. Very fleeting.
So it's a perfect segue into, I think, Melissa's stuff on talking about gender subtypes and other types of subtypes within the Final Fantasy character building as well. So without further ado, I think we're going to let we're going to see Melissa and let her do her thing.
All right.
Coming at you from Japan. And I worked with Dr. Wind Goodfriend on a chapter in the psychology of Final Fantasy. Our chapter was on gender subtypes. And this is kind of a subcategory of stereotypes. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about why we chose this topic and why we chose to do it with Final Fantasy. I have always really loved Final Fantasy. It was a real core part of when I was in high school and on those long summer vacations and just putting hours and hours into these endless RPGs. And the reason that I loved Final Fantasy was because there were so many different characters to choose from. And in a time where there weren't a lot of female characters to choose from as playable characters in video games, I really appreciated how there were just many different types of people. And so, for example, in Final Fantasy X, the one that I put the most playing time into, you could make a party of all women and it would be great. And you had your thief character and Riku, and you had, of course, the summoner and Yuna and your black mage, and just, it was a really nice experience for me as a young woman playing these games to have that option to make whatever parties I did want to make at that time. And of course, the game does guide you into making certain parties because of their abilities and the bosses, but that's just true with all kind of games. They're teaching you how to play the game itself. And with Final Fantasy, they do that by giving you so many different chess pieces, and it's up to you to organize them in the way that you want to play the game, some of which will just be more difficult than others. The characters themselves do have these kind of built-in roles and what their default paths of like power and abilities would be. So if we're going to talk about the most popular character, Cloud Strife, while in Final Fantasy VII there are all the materia, so you can give him healing materia if you do want him to support the rest of the party, he's just naturally going to be a better fighter because all of his stats are in like physical and resistance, and he has a sword. So it's just going to be better for him to be fighting than for him to be kind of stuck back behind everyone. So with these kind of default characters, that's where we get into the idea of stereotypes or archetypes in a kind of narrative sense. And we go into what's called subtypes, which are specific types of larger stereotypes. There's general ideas of what is common for men, or what is masculine, and what is common for women, what is feminine. But because we all meet different men and women every day, our definitions of men and women aren't like one single thing. So just the men in my life, I have my father, I have my husband, I have some of my students, I have my neighbors. And because I just interact with those different people in those different roles in my life, I have different ideas of what a father is like, and what a male neighbor is like, and what a male partner is like. Everyone has these kind of more nuanced ideas of gender subtypes. This kind of idea that all men are exactly the same cookie cutter is just a bit unrealistic. And Final Fantasy does a very good job of not making cookie cutter characters. You do have different men, different kinds of men, physically different kinds of men. You have larger men, smaller men, and they have different jobs, either like ranged fighters, or you do get some of the magic users. A lot of them hold swords, which is pretty typical. And then the same is for women. You have the healer is usually a woman. We'll get into that later. But you have other magic users. You have like the thief kind of character is usually a little bit more dexterous and a little bit more slight, one could say. And so we get into what some of these kind of subtypes of men and women are. An example of that is for men and women, there's kind of a typical parental figure. So like a mother figure. This is what a lot of people will know as the mom friend of the group. This is the person who's going to make sure everyone's okay, to make sure everyone's getting up on time. And you're going to find that a lot in Final Fantasy in the woman that's in the healer role of the party. In general, what we talk about in our chapter is that subtypes do appear to be better than just generic cookie cutter man, woman, but that doesn't mean that they're not problematic, because you're still kind of putting people into categories and giving them shoulds of like, this businesswoman should not be cold and this businessman should be cold. Still defining them by relatively limited ideas of what people are. In a video game, this makes sense. People have stories to tell, and players have stories to get through, and they have bosses to beat. But because we know that video games are such a popular media with young people who are learning social skills, they're learning about the world in general, and they're learning about people that they have never met, maybe in real life, it's important to kind of see the possible messages that they could be getting from these video games that they aren't getting anywhere else. Subtypes come in when it's presenting information to people who go to Final Fantasy to specifically seek information about men and women, but because they're given that message, that can reinforce what they're being given in other parts of their life. But as I said before, if they don't interact with different kinds of men on a regular basis, or you could even take subtypes across, away from gender, and put it into like race or class. If you don't usually interact with someone of a demographic, and then you play a video game that has that character is going to inform your expectations of those kinds of people, whether they're men or women or businessmen and businesswomen or mothers or fathers. And that's why subtypes are better than standard cookie cutters, but there's still a problem with holding value into this kind of predictable character creation method.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa, for that. That was super insightful. I think we all really enjoyed that, and I think the audience did too. Gave some really good insights on those different types of subtypes, and that's just one part of this wonderful book. And I think that it would be we would definitely be remiss to not talk about the actual storytelling within the book itself that the wonderful Dr. Cohort talks about, and maybe a little bit of Bushido as well, right?
That is correct.
Can I just, I wonder if I can just real quick ask Melissa one question. Is that all right? Melissa, the intricacies of what you just talk about, I think, are fascinating. How would you begin to propose that for a layman?
Hello.
Well, that doesn't really answer my question at all. You just said hello to me. I could do that for hours. I'll stop. That was awesome. I wish we could talk to her, but it's so great that she could provide that.
She's super fun to talk to.
Okay, get rid of that. Rachel, please, as my shenanigans end.
Sorry. The storytelling. Yes, so we can't talk about Final Fantasy without talking about its storytelling, both in terms of its structure and in terms of its content. So Final Fantasy takes a bottom-up approach to storytelling, where the character development is the main focus of the story rather than the overarching conflict. So this structure allows for the development of plot lines of individual characters long before you know what the major conflict is or plot twist, or before you learn about the genocidal cults. Like, really, you get to know the characters first. And this is unlike Western storytelling, where the conflict is typically disclosed at the beginning and the narrative revolves around resolving it. So the example I like to give is Skyrim. You find out there's a world eater dragon and you need to kill it, and then the plot revolves around that. Whereas Final Fantasy, you spend a significant amount of time learning about the characters before you learn about what the conflict is or how they're going to come together. So this storytelling is called a Kishanun Tetsu. I listened like 100 times to a pronunciation. That could be wrong, but I tried. A Kishanun Tetsu structure. And it comes from Chinese, Korean, and Japanese narratives. And has 4 components. So there's an introduction, where the characters and the setting and the situation are generally established. Then there's the development phase, which is really an expansion of the introduction. You might meet other characters, you might change settings, but no major plot changes occur. And then there's a twist, where the story takes a turn into a seemingly separate situation. It's not necessarily a conflict. It could be a shift in setting. It could be a shift in focus. And then there's the conclusion, which is the part that resolves all the acts, including the overarching conflict becomes resolved. So in Final Fantasy VI, told you I was going to talk about it. The ultimate conflict is with Kefka, right? He's the primary antagonist, but there are several other climactic moments leading up to the battle. There's Terra's transformation into an Esper, magical being. There's the murder of Science family. There's the attempted suicide of Celis. You potentially lose Shadow and Mog. So there's all these other elements happening. There's the opera scene, of course. So this kind of structure creates a space where the players feel invested in and integral to the success of the characters, while saving the world is always, the end goal in a lot of RPGs. What truly resonates in Final Fantasy are the characters and their relationships to each other. And I also want to make a point about game design, because Final Fantasy is used in a third-person perspective, and that really contributes to this kind of storytelling and the parasocial relationships. I know Dr. Daniel's going to talk about that, that we form with these characters. So with the focus on the narrative rather than the overarching conflict, we're like this outside force influencing the interaction between these characters, which again, in contrast to Skyrim, where you are the protagonist, you're in the first-person perspective. So what Final Fantasy has done is creating spaces where the player feels integral to the success of all of the characters. It's contingent upon what we do. And this is also very remarkable because the first Final Fantasy came out in 1987. And all my cohorts are of a similar age. So we were playing games at this time. And the other hot titles were Double Dragon, good game.
I still own
Punch
that
Out.
one.
Yeah, right.
Also
and Punch
good
Out, also a good game. But these are obviously vastly different from the wild worlds and fantastical worlds of Final Fantasy. So this focus on collective relationships rather than an individual's fight for glory. This is not just a byproduct of their storytelling, but it's also one of the ways in which it provides transnational insight, which is what Dr. Bean was alluding to, because it also carries these themes of Bushido, which is the way of the warrior in their narratives, which is loyal, duty, and honor. So while centrally it's about good and evil, saving the world, many characters struggle between doing what they think is the right thing to do and doing what they think is their duty in this inner conflict to maintain their honor. And Cloud is the perfect example of this. I'm sure many of us, myself included, shockingly, because I have zero time to play games, is playing the Final Fantasy remake. And he's a great example of how he has this inner conflict over doing what is right versus doing what's expected of him as a soldier turned mercenary. And Terra, again, in Final Fantasy VI, she also expresses uncertainty about what she should do because she used to be in the primary antagonist army, but now she wants to help the allies against him. And it's not just the main characters either. All of the supporting cast also generally show these themes in their dialogue. So again, in 6, Edgar, who is the king, he publicly maintains an allegiance with the ruling empire, who is the antagonist army, while he's secretly providing rebel and support and aid to the rebel group. So throughout the game, his dialogue and his actions really center around his inner conflict between what do I do as king, what is the right thing to do, but what's like really the honorable thing for me to do as like a human in this world, you know, seeing these horrible things happen. And then there's the role of women, which I have to talk about at least briefly, because it also reflects the Japanese culture. And many installments of Final Fantasy have strong, competent female players. We have Terra and Celis in 6. We have Yuna in 10. We have Lightning in 13. And this was so far ahead of its time, having women as powerful, competent leaders that show agency. They have leadership roles. They're not defined by their costumes, which, you know, has historically been the case, especially in the fantasy genre of games. And if we look at Japanese culture, the first ruling empress of Japan reigned in 593 AD. And, you know, in Western and United States, we still haven't had a female president, so we're a little bit behind. So the use of female characters in these games really reflects the cultural emphasis that they put on women as leaders. So taking all of this together, the bottom-up storytelling, the elements of Bushido, what they've created are these timeless stories that stick with us because we spend, you know, like 100 hours getting to know them and getting to love them. And we're not playing these games as ourselves, but we're like investing our time and energy in these relationships of these other people. And I think understanding this kind of psychological storytelling is really key to understanding the draw and longevity of these games. So while Battle of Good versus Evil like brings us there, but it's the relationships and their struggles and the genocide and the trauma that keep us there time and time again.
Now, have you ever seen any game that can do this, a game series done similar to what Final Fantasy has? Obviously, the JRPG genre itself is massively like it's almost like sometimes in a cultish style of people that are playing it.
Careful.
Alter his subject.
You're preaching a sore subject.
Definitely. There's a lot of people who use this story structure, like Chrono Trigger is a good example. But I think Final Fantasy, what makes them different is that they've done it consistently over time in every iteration. They've stayed true to it. Whereas like Chrono Trigger is just a one-off, right? But Final Fantasy is definitely not the only one who does it. They just do it so good.
They do a pretty good job with that, I would say. That's why we keep on buying them. It's almost like inherently like very similar games, but it's
right.
Like, they're not. It's crazy.
They're not. The characters are different.
Yeah.
The term final is becoming more and more ironic as
Right.
more are being brought into the series.
Yeah. Yes. You think the guy who made Final Destination was like, they're onto something. Final Destination 37. You know, Land Before Time was like, let's go back and name all 30 of our movies. The final Land Before Time 7.
Final Fantasy. That's right.
Well, one of the things that Dr. Cowart was talking about that I really, really appreciate about the bottom-up storytelling is that it doesn't put the player in this position of like the omniscient player, right? Who knows all of these things that are happening, who's basically watching kind of in a way their little pawns go through an experience that we're already privy to. One of the things I love so much about it is that, not to hint a little bit at what I'm going to be talking about, but as these different characters have these revelations, these groundbreaking moments that they have in understanding the way that they interact with the world or learning about themselves, like we may have gotten some hints as to that happening, but we learn that in the same moment that they are. And I think it's really cool that we're not in this position of like an omniscient player. We are experiencing these things as the characters are because of that bottom-up storytelling.
Yeah. And it's like, I know you're talking about 10, but it's like what we learn at the end of 10, right? And everyone is just like, oh, and everyone learns it.
That's a
Spoiler alert, this whole panel is going to be
20 years old. It's 20 years
If
old.
they haven't played it by now, they're in trouble.
Yeah, why are you here? Why are you watching us if you haven't? Do you know what this is?
Ryan, they just wanted to come see.
Right. Mima, go back to bed. Go back to bed, Mima. Come on now.
What are they talking about on this widget?
She gets scared when she watches me. on the Technicolor tube.
UHF.
Yeah.
These are things that are powered by radon tubes still, right?
That's right.
That's correct.
It kind of brings us into a good segue because of, cults, where we talked about to Fusro Doc over here, Dr. Emery.
That was my segue?
That was your segue. The cults, because, we give you all the really fun things to talk about, in part parasocial relationships too, because you have tons of experience with that.
I do. That just means I don't have many friends. I'm just kidding. So first and foremost, I mean, and it's interesting to kind of piggyback off what Dr. Coat was saying with social presence and feeling like you connect with these characters, and that's a very common theme. But in the bigger umbrella, there's social presence and there's also spatial presence. But the thing that we kind of get in with telepresence and just feeling like there's an illusion that you are connected, and one of the reasons why we love playing Final Fantasy so much is part of how we bring in those relationships, again, like social presence. But to that point, yes, Tony does give me a lot of dark topics. When I wrote a chapter for Psychology of Legend of Zelda, I got the 5 stages of grief from Majora's Mask, the Kubler-Ross model, and now I get genocidal cults. So
there you go.
But it was something that Dr. Bean said, I want you to write about something about religion in Final Fantasy. And I was like, that's almost every game. 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 15 tactics. I was like, okay, we got to narrow it down a little bit. So I really wanted to kind of focus in on Final Fantasy X, because Final Fantasy X is one of the most unique representations of religion in this case, because when you start playing it, first and foremost, the debatable name Titus.
Right.
It's a debate every time.
Titus.
It's Titus.
Just stick with Titus. That's
we'll
fine.
go with Titus.
Money.
Yeah.
Tito.
I'm sure this will come up in the chat plenty of times, but it is what it is. When you first awaken and go to Besaid as Titus, you are immediately welcome. Well, actually, I wouldn't say welcome, because like as soon as you come in, there's an older lady that goes, "Stay away from the senator." But it's you can.
Mima,
really
go back to
tell-
bed. Go back to bed, Mima.
That's Mima right there. That's Mima.
Gonna hurt yourself.
It is something that you already understand where Yevon comes in, and this is it's a cult in an instance here, where it's a deliberate killing of large groups of, particularly dealing with people who don't worship Yevon, and this is people who use Machina in this case. It's a decimation of the Ronzo. It's the destruction of Albed's home. And it's the general treatment of the Albed as well. Because, I mean, Waka's a racist. I mean, they blow up home and he's like, don't think of it as your home being destroyed. Think of it as happy little fireworks. And that's a real line that he says to Riku, which is awful. But the thing is, it's this teaching of Yevon that really comes into play when it comes to Final Fantasy X. And the big thing is, within what we know about Yevon is this belief that there is Yevon and Unalesca, and they are high up in this church, and people who have never talked to them. So this is where parasocial relationships come in, is this one-way communication. I've never talked to this person, Yevon, or Lady Unaleska. However, I feel like there's something really strong in terms of a bond between these two, to the point where they make a religion based off of it. They make a complete following that's all over Spira. And anything that goes against it, aka Machina, is automatically downplayed or again, looking at Waka is automatically rejecting it, anything towards Machina, to the point where Seymour uses it, and Waka's still like, hey, shouldn't we not use Machina to destroy other Machina users? So the belief is there. But what's ironic is when you play through Final Fantasy X, there are little kind of numbers that go throughout the game, because Yuna's supposed to sacrifice herself to Sin. She's supposed to release the final Aeon. And in doing so, she will destroy Sin for like 10 years, right? But that's not, it'll eventually come back. And they don't realize the thing that they're doing is trying to bring the calm is ultimately the thing that keeps bringing Sin back. So you have a religion that is flawed right from the beginning, but they don't realize that yet. So they're going through something called cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is when you have two conflicting thoughts going through your brain simultaneously. So they're in this constant position, Lulu, Waka, Yuna, I'd say Kimari, but Kimaro talks so little, it's kind of hard to see what's going on in his brain in this case. But they all, throughout the game, kind of chipping away at these beliefs. So, when Seymour uses Machina, that's one thing. And then Waka's like, that seems sacrilegious. And he's like, nah, don't worry about it. And then they're branded as heretics because Yuna refuses a marriage from Seymour. And they're like, should we still believe in you? Yeah, and they're like, well, we need to vindicate ourselves and say, it's the church, it's not Yevon. And it's not until the final moments when and again, here comes the big spoiler, is when you meet with Lady Unaleska and she goes, by the way, there is absolutely no atonement. Do you think you can absolutely get rid of all Machina? I know. And it breaks Lulu in half. I mean, she is just like, you said if we were to go through complete atonement, Sin would be gone and out of our lives for good. And Unaleska's like, no, that's not it at all. And it's only then that all the Scooby-Doo gang of Final Fantasy X kind of get it and say, we need to do a different route. Even though what's interesting is you've got characters like Riku and Aran and Titus who challenge these traditional beliefs in different ways. Riku is very much stop, think about it, listen, but she doesn't really have a defense as to why, except for I'm part of the Albed, you're not, and we need to kind of clash on this. But it's good to have a dissenter. Aran's been through it before. He's been down this road before. So he has a little experience, but he kind of lets Yuna go through it a little bit. And then Titus, again, or Titus, he just tries to challenge everything.
Let's just pause for this. Say Titus, you're probably right. Yeah. You're probably right.
It comes up so much, but
we're going to accept you regardless.
What it does come into is, again, these parasocial relationships, how we feel about religious cult leaders. So, I mean, you can look at a lot of different famous cults as to why this happens. People have these relationships that aren't actually real, with Jim Jones, Marshall Applewhite, and Bonnie Nettles with Heaven's Gate. Shikiro, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. These are all cults based on this idea of following somebody. And this is where I think Riku has one of the best lines is, shouldn't you start thinking for yourselves and try to challenge that belief? And so that's where cognitive dissonance consistently breaks down. And it is one of the reasons why I liked writing this chapter, is because I feel like there's something to be said for how do we understand beliefs and how they can be positive things, but they can also be something that's extremely hard to break down if they're dangerous. Because again, it takes an entire 60 to 70 hour game for everybody to go, maybe we should find another way to beat Sin. And that's kind of how it goes. And
I just want everyone to crystallize this moment that he said he did like enjoying writing about this, so you can't use that against me any further, okay?
Yeah, support our cult on Patreon.
I mean, it's literally recorded now. It's on record.
It is on record.
Yes.
That's my chapter. I loved writing it, even though it is super depressing. I'm gonna have to get a positive chapter next time.
Aren't you gonna?
You're good at writing the depressing ones.
You're, it's like right
keep
in your
tossing
wheelhouse.
What does that say about Emery?
right. It's like, Ryan, you get bubbles. Lee, you get rainbows. Rachel, you get wings. Tony, you get butterflies. No, not this time, just in general. Tony, you get butterflies. Steven, you get death. Oh.
He gets a sickle.
Can I write about...
He's trying to get us.
Can I write about literate caterpillars? You're like, absolutely not. Never.
No? Okay.
No transformation for you.
Right, none. Quick, I have a quick question for all of you. You can pop into, I always want to say Kamari's head, and you just get a glimpse when he's just sitting there with his little tongue like halfway out, looking sort of not very thoughtful, and there's other people are doing stuff, and he's just thinking about his brothers or something. What do you think he's thinking about, Steven? The first thing, Kamari, what's in his head?
Kamari is, in my mind, always thinking about what's Lulu or not. What is Yuna gonna do next? And his pensive look of just, it was like somebody said protect her, and that's all he did. It's like when your friend ironically tells you, hey, stare at something, look at this, or can you watch my bag for a second? And that's literally all you do.
Pretty much.
That to me is Kamari. It's like Yuna's dad said, hey, Kamari, make sure to watch my daughter. Okay.
you give him a lot more credit than I give. I see him, and I feel like he looks like he's deep, but if you went in there, you just hear through the echoed abyss of his brain, catnip, nip, nip. And then it's just catnips and Yuna, and I think that's it. Catnip and Yuna.
I was going to say donuts.
Donuts?
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Kelly, as a proud cat mom, I see Kamari, and I'm like, he is perpetually wondering if he fits. And if he does, he fits.
He's going in there.
Either that or plotting world domination. One or the other. Cats have two modes.
Right.
So.
That's a fair point.
I mean, I just think that he really just wants to know, when are we going to stop so I can go to the bathroom?
That's probably fair. It's really embarrassing.
I have yet to see a litter box in Spira.
Right. This is true.
The
just like there are no
is a litter
toilets
box.
in Skyrim.
Right.
There are no litter baskets in Spira.
Do you pee in the Blitzball sphere? We'll stop from there. We'll just keep going.
gotta move this along.
We gotta move it on.
Move this along.
Does
if
one
you eat
urinate?
that much cheese, does
you
it
hit
really
you
matter?
hit your quota. That's it.
That's all I get. That's all I'm allowed to have. Yeah, that's fair.
Which brings us into how I've been traumatized by Ryan Kelly for many years at this point. And I sometimes
that was a good segue.
That was a great one.
That was a
Wait,
good
hold on.
segue.
Where are you? There. Yep. Nope. This way. This way. Hey.
Come the other way.
Yeah.
There it is.
Fusion.
Fusion.
Hey. Perfect.
Sorry, go ahead.
What's really funny is that when you actually put your finger over it, it actually like gave you some of the lights that looked like you were actually fusing.
That's amazing.
I know. It was really, really
I'm
awesome.
so happy about that.
You'd never guess, but we all actually know each other outside of PAX.
No,
Turns out.
we just met each other today.
And you've been traumatized in that amount of time.
That's how fast. I mean, it's a gift.
Doesn't take long. No.
But I mean, it brings up the idea of how do we move past this? I don't think I can ever move past Ryan in any of his traumatization towards me.
I'm very sorry.
I don't think you are.
A lot of it is against your will. Yeah.
Which leads us into where Leah's chapter kind of comes on into play of what is trauma and how do we actually overcome it.
Yeah, so anyone who has played even the first 20 minutes of any Final Fantasy game can acknowledge that those characters go through some serious traumatic events. Witnessing the death of their parents or realizing one day that you're actually dead. Those are some serious situations that they're all dealing with. And so the things I'm going to be talking about are defining trauma, how it's used as a core component of character development throughout the Final Fantasy series, and how it's used as narrative development for the idea of collective trauma. In that trauma doesn't just happen to individuals, it can also happen to groups of people, which ties in really well with what Dr. Daniel was talking about. So moving on, defining trauma. So typically experts will put trauma into two categories. There's little t trauma, as in like lowercase t trauma, and then big T trauma, like capital T trauma. Little t trauma is stuff that we all experience at some point in our lives. No one ever escapes it. It's the things like, moving to a new town and losing your friends, or a family pet dying, or witnessing your parents fight. These are things that they shake us, they make us grieve, but ultimately in the course of, days, weeks, or months, we get over it, maybe think back on it, and it causes a little bit of a sting. Big T trauma, on the other hand, is something that shakes us. And at its core, it really redefines the way that we interact with the world. Those traumatic experiences teach us a lesson, and we carry those lessons moving forward. These are things that can expand everything from the death of a loved one, to experiencing assault, to realizing that the lessons that you've been taught about your entire purpose in life was actually a lie, and you're just perpetuating sin for the rest of your life. As I said before, I'm going to be.
I feel
talking
like
about something in particular?
I feel like we're talking about like Catholicism now.
Specific. Oh dear. Oh, we're not going to go. We'll stick to you, Yevon, there. Praise be to Yevon. Anyway, so those are kind of the two different categories. And Final Fantasy, because it's developed so many different games that take place in all these different worlds, and they've told so many different stories, they've been able to really use trauma as a mechanism of character development. Trauma in and of itself is a conflict that we experience that we take with us moving forward. And these lessons that we learn about how to interact with the world, they're really well intentioned, right? What we're doing is trying to move forward in our life with that piece of trauma that we're carrying with us. Unfortunately, trauma lessons are not always things that help us to lead healthy lives. They're things that help us to avoid the pain of what we experienced. So we learn to avoid things that were disturbing to that caused us pain or were disturbing to us, or we experience depressive symptoms or anxious symptoms. I talk a lot in the book chapter about like the different symptoms of trauma and how that manifests for individuals and for characters in the book. So I won't jump too much into detail on that. But the idea is that that trauma teaches us lessons. We carry those lessons forward with us, and those lessons that we've learned actually don't help us to lead healthy lives. They just help us to avoid the pain of what happened to us. I think Final Fantasy is an outstanding example, and particularly Final Fantasy X, because it shows us really different ways that individuals process through trauma or do not process through trauma. And I think Titus is a really excellent example of that. I'm going to go ahead and call him Titus because that's what I've been calling him since I was really young, and that's just what we're going to move forward with.
It's fine.
So,
Totally
T-Money.
T-Money.
T-Slick. T-Dog. No. So Titus, he has a father, Jack, who's like this absolute celebrity. Everyone loves him. But Titus knows the truth, right? That he is an abusive father. He is abusive to the mother and to Titus as well. And when you have a parent like that, often, as Titus did, individuals grow up believing that they're incapable, right? Titus couldn't protect himself. He couldn't convince the world of what Jack really was. He couldn't protect his mother. So when Titus wakes up in the beginning of Final Fantasy X, he is still that kind of person who's carrying with him those trauma lessons of, I am incompetent, I am not capable, I cannot save the people that I love. And Titus's story isn't just about defeating sin. Titus's story is about learning the lessons and learning to counteract the lessons that he learned from sin / his abusive father. What he learns throughout the entire storyline is that he is competent and he is capable, and that he is capable of protecting the ones that he loves, essentially. So Titus is a really great example of that process that he goes through. And it's interesting, Dr. Kelly's going to talk a little bit more about amnesia, but one of the major, one possible consequence of trauma is amnesia, right? Which is essentially you forget what happened to you. It's an avoidance symptom. You basically erase the memory of what happened. And trauma itself, it's not just the conflict that it creates, but that particular symptom of amnesia is actually really critical for Titus. Because can you imagine him waking up and like some kind of, I don't know, Deus Ex Machina comes down and is like, hey, by the way, you dead. Like, you're not real. Like, his character was...
And game over.
His character was not ready to receive that information. He needed an entire game's worth of character development to be able to hear that information, process it, and put it to use in a meaningful way. So Titus is a really great example of a long and arduous journey of overcoming trauma. And then we get to one of my other favorite characters in Final Fantasy X, Seymour. And I know there are a lot of people who are like, why the hell is that your favorite character? Okay, so Seymour seems like a real jerk, right? That's like essentially his character.
That's in your chapter, isn't it?
I literally wrote the words, Seymour seems like a real jerk, and of all the publications I've ever done in my life, that is my favorite sentence I've ever written. So, Seymour seems like a real jerk, but also, Seymour witnessed the death of his mother. That's like the most traumatic thing, well, in the category of some of the most traumatic things you could possibly experience as a person. And so, when Seymour is trying to, destroy the world and destroy pain, what he's doing is using his trauma lesson and not overcoming trauma. He's like, hey, this lesson that I learned about, the best way to not experience pain is just die and avoid all the pain. Yeah, that's what I'm going to go with. That's going to be the lesson I take forward in life. Like, if that's not a lesson in trauma, I don't know what is. So I think he's a really excellent example of, someone who just seems like he's a real jerk, has a real thorn in his side, seems to only exist to be a pain in the butt to all the other characters. But really what Seymour is doing is constantly dealing with the conflict of the death of his mother, and how to actually process that kind of pain, which is an extraordinary pain to be dealing with. Moving on to my last bit, I do want to talk a little bit about how trauma is not something that only afflicts individuals, right? It can afflict a collective. And I think that the story, the lie of the Summoner's Pilgrimage is a really excellent example of that. So the entirety of the universe that we see in Final Fantasy X, or I should say the followers of Yu Yevon, believe that, like, hey, these summoners, from the time they're little, they're going to be, trained in the art of magic. They're going to grow up, they're going to get their posse, and they're going to go kill Sin, and that's going to be what happens. So that's a lie. That's not what actually happens. What actually happens is that they defeat Sin and then become reincarnated as Sin and then end up propagating Sin. And I think that that's actually a really excellent metaphor for trauma in and of itself, because trauma, oftentimes the thing that looks like it's going to be the thing that helps you is not actually the thing that's going to help you. It's going to be the thing that actually continues to propagate that issue. Do you think that by eliminating the world of pain and killing off everything, that's going to help Seymour process his trauma? No, that's not what's going to help it. The same reason that killing off Sin and becoming the next Sin isn't going to be what solves it. So basically, the entirety of the followers of Yu Yevon are duped, right? They have been presented with this lie, and they continue to engage in this unhealthy behavior, which ultimately ends up propagating that lie and continuing to force it onto the next generation of summoners. It isn't until these individuals, this group of people of Titus, Yuna, Lulu, all of them, turn around and say, there's got to be something different that we can do here, something that's actually going to conquer this in its entirety. And so by looking at the path that seemed like the one that was the one they were supposed to take and challenging it and choosing a new path, what they do is they break the cycle of trauma, and they end up being able to essentially save the world from the propagation of that. There's a lot more details in this. I read the chapter before we did this panel, and I'm like, I want to talk about all these things, but I can't. So not that this is an advertisement, but if you are interested in more of this, you should totally pick up the book, because we get to talk a lot more details about really happy trauma. Oh yeah, wait. Oh, it's
for you, it's straight up.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about this one.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I think that it's a really good way of what you kind of explain trauma in the book itself, but also the way that you just kind of explained it to everybody else, is because what a lot of people don't seem to understand is trauma can come in a lot of different forms and cause a lot of dysfunction in our lives in lots of many areas, including our cognitive ability and our memories. Oh my gosh, it's almost like we don't know who's coming next here. There, Dr. R. Kelly.
Right, yeah. Hey, thanks, Tony.
Hey, you're welcome.
Oh, this looks. This actually looks weird. This doesn't look good at all. When I do that. That doesn't look like a high five at all. It looks like a low 6. Sorry.
You hit your quota.
I already hit it. Does it reset? Or is it done for the whole?
That's
No,
not
it doesn't.
Another panel.
Not
There'll be
for
another
you.
panel for that.
I worked hard on this. That's good. All right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and I like that Leah went first because, with trauma has a lot to do with a very, very difficult memory of some kind. And the idea is, and it does tend to start with one significant event that we have memory over. But the reason I wanted to write my chapter on memories and memory loss and ultimately identity and relationships as it relates is, to me, that's the most important underlying theme to all the Final Fantasies. Because, the idea is, I think sometimes we tend to think of memories as these magical concepts, these things that exist in a spiritual way that can't be quantified, and they're very feelings of the memories are so accurate and they don't change over time. Right.
Imagination.
And it's in actuality, and admittedly, human memories are more advanced than every other creature. But the idea is even the simplest life form have memories. And when it boils down to it, they're not these remarkable, exceptional, unquantifiable things. They boil down to these little bundles of neurons that were created based upon what we were paying attention to. So it ignores a lot from the get-go. And then it hopefully fires the same way that it fired the first time when it was made each time. But it doesn't actually. So you think about even just and we call those engrams. You think about just the basics. You have a memory, it fires the same way. When you remember something, you're not even remembering the instance. You're remembering the last time you remembered it. And that engram gets broken down. Some of it deteriorates. New things get added based upon your current perception of the world and how it has changed. And you identify with it. This incredibly fallible, unreliable, unrealistic thing is something that we base our identity and our life and our meaningful world connections and our relationships around. So, not to so dooming in the state of humans, but I love Final Fantasy because they proactively use memory and memory loss as a tool. One of I think the most readily available tool or types of memory devices they use is amnesia. Over 13 of the main entries have amnesia, whether